Check, 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 check. Hey, hey, hey. Test one, two, three. Check, check, hello. Hey, 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 hey. Check, 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 check. Test one, two, three. One, two, three. One, two, three. Check, hello. Hey, 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 hey. Check, check.
Right. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this session on strengthening resilience of urban communities. I think it's great that there is a specific urban theme in every plenary session at this conference, so thank you very much to the organizers. And we have a great panel today bringing a number of diverse viewpoints on approaches to strengthening resilience of urban communities, particularly poorer, more vulnerable, more marginalized urban communities who will definitely be facing the risks of climate change and feeling the effects of climate change much more strongly than urban populations who maybe operate or live in the formal sector, who have access to insurance, who have legal title over their land and so don't need to worry about being evicted if their homes get flooded, and who have a steady stream of income. These factors all contribute to building their resilience to climate change. As many of you hopefully know, the Sustainable Development Goals includes a goal around cities. Goal 11 is for safe, inclusive, resilient, sustainable cities. So here we're focusing particularly on the inclusive and the resilient part, without, of course, forgetting about the sustainable and safe elements. So throughout this session, we will be looking at practical examples of solutions being implemented around Asia for building the resilience of particular urban communities, and also the lessons that can be taken for expanding and applying this approach around the region. So what we really want to focus on is what can be done not only for, but also with and by the affected populations in urban areas to build their resilience, and also thinking beyond resilience. Salim this morning mentioned the need for transformative adaptation. So can we take this opportunity for climate change adaptation to change some of the structural inequalities that are driving vulnerability, that are disempowering certain population groups within a city? So these are questions I hope we'll be answering today. So we have three presentations followed by some responses from a discussant. I will introduce each speaker as they come up before their presentation. And then we will hold all the questions until the end once all our speakers and discussants have gone ahead. So firstly, we have a presentation from Suranjana Gupta of the Huayru Commission based in Bangalore in India, and Josephine Castillo of the Solidarity of Oppressed Filipino People Incorporated, based here in the Philippines. Josephine is a community organizer of more than 20 years experience. and a founding leader of Solidarity of Oppressed Filipino People Incorporated, a federation of 235 community based organizations in the Philippines. So, Suranjana and Josephine together will share the experiences of the Dampa in the Philippines. So, please go ahead. You can click through here. They should, yeah. So, I think if you point to that.
Good afternoon. My name is Suranjana, and I'm here representing the WIRO Commission. We're a global network of grassroots women's organizations and partners, and our focus is on empowering grassroots women to lead their communities towards more sustainable and resilient development. And we're currently focused on catalyzing and scaling up resilience practices led by grassroots women in both urban and rural areas through Community Resilience Fund. We use this fund to channel resources to grassroots organizations and organize. What grassroots groups do is they create risk maps, prioritize risks, take actions, and then leverage these to gain both recognition and resources from local and national governments. And I just want to introduce Jokas, my colleague's presentation, by saying a couple of things. The first is this term transformation that we keep hearing. Um, some people are critical of it because they find it a little vague. But I think for us, here we are looking at two clear elements that are very important for us in terms of what must be transformed. The first is that we must move away from seeing communities purely as beneficiaries and work with them as agents and drivers of climate change adaptation and mitigation and as agents of resilience. I think that's very important, primarily because their marginalization and exclusion are big contributing factors to their vulnerability. So it is this exclusion that allows their vulnerabilities to persist over time. And so that's got to change. And the second piece is really gaining institutional recognition and resources for community led initiatives. So I think when you listen to Jokas, just listen for both the issue of how communities are driving change in communities and how they're trying to move from the informal to the formal. Okay, so I'll let you listen to her.
So thank you, Sranjana. Then, so good afternoon to all of us. I don't need to one by one. Okay. So have a good day to all of us. I hope you will learn something from me. Okay. So I'm Jokas. So I'm working with the community people. I'm also a grassroots leader from my own community. So I starting working with poor people way back 1980s. So as an organizer, and now I'm the national coordinator of DAMPA or SOFP, and at the same time, a governing council of Wiro Commission. Okay. So DAMPA is almost like 22 years working with poor people in the Philippines, entire Philippines. We started for 17, and now we have 247 community organization in rural and urban areas. So we started this advocacy because of securing land tenure. Before there's a massive demolition way back in 1995 in Bitastinda, Tondo, where many poor people were displaced and many died because of unhuman demolitions. Next, and then Okay. So I want to say that as informal settlers, there's a lot. If you can see around Metro Manila, there's a lot of informal settlers, and I worked before in 1995 with these people who are living in Kamanaba Flood Control Project. So we organized 1,000 families and we formed a network and loose coalition for 7,500 families who were relocated in Bulacan, in North Sagaray and San Jose, and the three relocation areas, which Pabahay 2,000, North Hills Village, and Towerville. But before they were relocated, the their they can access well for the basic services, and they can their works, their jobs, they earn money than before they were relocated. When they were relocated, if you can see, they owned makeshift houses and above the water. See, because it was along the river banks. And then after that, they were relocated to Bulacan, in which, if you can see, their houses were developed, but their livelihood become lower. Their lives were not uplift and they were down. So the money that they earned before when they were in the Kamanaba areas is that like they earned 350 pesos per day, but when they were relocated in faraway places in Bulacan, they just earned 100 pesos. And why? Because of the transportation. See? And then some of them did not access to basic services when they were in resettlement sites, like health facilities. They have no clinics in the inside the resettlement sites. They have no livelihoods. And I will tell you the truth, there's a lot of people who suffer from broken family. Why? I think you will say, why there was broken family? Because the head of the family, because they're far from the city, so they just go back home weekly. And men need women. You know that already. I will no longer explain it why there is a lot of broken family in the resettlement sites. But it's the side effect of people who are displaced and bring to faraway places. So our learnings here is that if you will just let the people develop themselves in in their own areas, like up on-site development or upgrading, and let them, lend them money, borrow them money to develop their houses, then they can do that because they are skilled. These informal settlers are skilled. They have knowledge how to develop themselves. So all we need to do is just give them capacity building, help them, not give them down to the some of our. I don't like to say something what is not good, but it's a part of my experience that in terms of if the government want us to have successful projects or programs that they want to implement in the grassroots communities, then why not let the people be involved? So inclusive. It must be inclusive so that no one is left behind. See? So from planning, designing, implementation, and monitoring the projects, the people must be involved. Huh? It's not, there are some people, government, or I don't want to say what government is, but mostly it depends on the political will who are on the position, you know. So we the grassroots people, we need to we are happy to work and partner with the government. Why? Because we are also the one who will benefit the program. So, but sometimes I don't know if they don't trust us, but at this time we're no longer vulnerable, we're no longer victims, we are agent for change, especially disaster risk reductions. So you need to approach us, you need to partner with us. We are organized. Imagine I'm working for almost 2.5 decades in organizing. So our communities are already empowered, our grassroots women are empowered, and we do collaboration with the government, we do partnership. Why not trust us, right? And one of my uh, experience is that, like, if you are poor, then they're thinking, these people are not good character. But if you can do this as an organizer, I work for almost two decades. You know that the poor people are better to be a good friend, because they will fight for you just to be safe. If you are helping them, if you are assisting them, they will fight for your life. I will tell you the truth. That's my experience as an organizer. And the bottom up approach is very important. Huh? I want to tell you that stop going to the community and telling this is the project that you need. And you can see that in the future it will not succeed. Why? Because you're the one who say that this is what you want, but you did not consult the people in the bottom up. So you need to have a bottom up approach so that you will know what is the real issues and concerns of the people living in that informal settlers. So that it will be more successful. I work for how many years? I'm always telling you, I work for how many years, but only until now, it's already 2017, 2019. Only few people understand how to work with the community people. I hope, I hope this in the next how many decades with the new generations, I hope that the government, private institution, business institution or whatever who want to develop our country or our communities will work with us and collaborate with us as partners, not as enemy. Huh? Because maybe because they do rally. No, we do mobilization and rally because you don't care for us. So we need to do that. Huh? So that you will notice us. You will, you will see what is our real issue. So I think that's all that I can say. Thank you.
Um, Let me just add to a couple of things because I've been studying Jokas's work in the Philippines for quite a while. So while they started as organizing grassroots groups and communities in the informal settlements to get secure tenure, they've also, for example, done a lot of work with trying to get water supply. So they have water cooperatives where grassroots groups pool or households pool their savings and come together and work with the barangay to advocate to the national government for water supply. And in one of the communities right here in Manila, they were able to get the government to set up the water infrastructure and pay for it. And then the communities pay for and manage the distribution of the water within the settlements. So so that's one kind of solution. They've also done a lot of monitoring of health centers in Manila. And you know that as sort of climate change is going to cause a lot of health issues, and we need the health system to be accessible and functioning. They've identified beneficiaries for social protection programs, and this is something that we've seen in the region with many grassroots groups in Asia. And we've also seen the work that DAMPA has done on monitoring government programs and monitoring the distribution of relief in disasters. So there's a lot of active roles that communities are playing in order to improve the delivery of government programs, because also because communities also have a lot of hyper local data about uh, households and their vulnerabilities, which is not available with government or is not updated in government records. Um, the collaborations between communities and government, in many cases in the region we're seeing, is also something that demonstrates and shows how the decentralization process can actually work for communities. So there's a lot of benefits, mutual benefits to partnering with communities. They make the delivery of programs more effective, and communities themselves uh, can access programs more effectively. So the last 2 points I want to make. One is that I think in terms of financing what a lot of people don't realize is many community groups in the region, federations, cooperatives, savings groups, all have their own savings. They set up social funds, emergency funds, which they are managing and using for crises and often for livelihoods as well. For example, Dampa has used grants as revolving funds for regenerating livelihoods after Typhoon Haiyan. And lastly, I just want to say that yes, communities do need technical and financial assistance, but this needs to be um, designed in a way that is useful and accessible to communities and actually feeds into and builds upon the work that is doing. I think very often we are starting the other way. We are going with the technology and financing, and that's determining who gets what money for what. So I think we have to turn that on its head and work more effectively with communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Saranjana and Josephine. I think that was very rousing from Josephine, and I think it really demonstrated as well the ways in which it is important to work with local communities and not merely treat them as beneficiaries. I think we've seen many instances of relocation projects where local residents were not involved in any way, and they actually ended up less resilient as a result of the relocation project. So it's time to move on from that. So our next speaker is Kenneth McClune, a senior scientist at the Institute for Social and Environment Transition, or ICET International. And he's got nearly 25 years of experience in working climate change, including working on the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network in the region. So thank you, Kenneth.
Adjust this. Which one? One that's well used. Okay. Hi. So I want to really emphasize, I'm going to go off script, which is something I'm comfortable doing, and sort of emphasize what was highlighted in the last part, which was that the importance of the bottom-up approach. Because my background is in climate science, and adaptation really is a process of impacts at the local level and adapting to those. So the real knowledge and the real capacity and the real understanding of the challenges are at the local level. Now, there's a lot of other aspects to it that also need multiple scales, and we shouldn't ignore all scales, and it's not one scale driving the whole issue. But it's very, very important, particularly with adaptation, that the bottom-up processes be highlighted and brought home. So I'm going to talk today about a case from our work in Da Nang in Vietnam on climate resilient housing. But I do want to point out that this cover photo is actually from Houston and from the recent storm in Houston. So it's a global challenge, the issue of typhoons or hurricanes in this case, and urban development and communities. So I always like to start off the very basics. It's a good reminder for me anyway, because when you get so much into the details, you forget why you're doing the work. And we're doing this work to address poverty. That's really what we're trying to do. And one of the major challenges for addressing poverty and getting out of poverty are disasters. Because there's this cycle where there's a disaster, a hazard event that creates a disaster that leads to high recovery costs and not enough time, and not enough period of time passes before you can recover before the next disaster. So this cycle of poverty cycle of disaster and poverty asks us, how can we reduce the cost of recovery? How can we reduce potentially the impacts from a disaster? And how can we reduce the recurrence interval, how often it happens? Now, with a lot of work has been done on building infrastructure that can help reduce recurrence intervals, but that's also led to economic growth, and these are good things, and there's nothing wrong with that, but that's also led to increased risk-taking. So you'll see people build along embankments that weren't designed that way, and so there's some challenges that come along the way as well. So what are the major challenges to this? Well, one of the biggest challenges, and that's why we're all here, is climate change, right? Because if you talk about return periods, historically we could use both historic reconstructions from written texts as well as like geology to understand the frequency of events. How often did, like, that's where we get the term 100-year flood. So if a flood had a 100-year return period, the period of time that whoever was exposed to that flood could recover would take, if recovery was less than 100 years, then it was a worthwhile risk to take. Their capital could grow, they could escape poverty because they would be able to build up enough resource to recover from a flood. Now with climate change, something like a 20-year flood will become potentially a 5-year flood or a 2-year flood. And there's a good case actually from the Philippines from coconut growers whose crop takes 7 years to mature before they can start harvesting. And after a recurrent number of storms came through, they found the government came in and said, well, you know, these storms were going to start happening more frequently. They might happen every 2 to 3 years. And they were like, you know, we can't recover in that period of time. So these are the challenges. These return periods are very important in understanding and the impact of climate change on those return periods. So since not only can we not build the infrastructure likely to completely prevent these return periods affecting us, and they're going to get worse, what are some other ways that we can break that cycle? So one is through reducing the impact, and that's our work in climate resilient housing in Da Nang. And so some of the challenges, particularly in central Vietnam, are a lot of the housing is not of high quality, particularly for the poor and most poor. It is the most affected sector from typhoons. The households themselves are poor and low income, so they struggle to recover from these storms. There's limited access to financial resources and to the technical know-how on how to address these issues. And the government is largely focused on recovery, so as opposed to prevention. And there's also a rapid urbanization going on. So there's more and more people trying to fit in more space, which drives a lot of the vulnerability. And I use the term vulnerability not to mean weakness. It just means that you're placing yourself at risk. So this is really cool because this is where working with the community to understand how houses were used and in their livelihoods and in their daily life, working with a architectural firm that won a design competition, and working with the various scales and systems that in Da Nang, we came up with these climate resilient housing units. So along the bottom of this slide, you can see the different style of and different angles at which these houses are built. And you can see how the winds from typhoons, the design elements were that the winds from typhoons would not only be able to pass through the homes, but they were disrupted in such a way that their strength would be reduced as they interacted with the house. So the weight-bearing qualities and the structure of the house actually interacted with the winds in such a way that didn't amplify them, but dampened them. There's also a safe room built in the center so that there was a safe location that didn't have windows that could be escaped to during these storm events. In floods, there's actually an upstairs where important household capital could be elevated to during floods, as well as an escape hatch on the roof so they could get out of the top floor if the floodwaters got that high. Another really interesting thing about the aspect of this design element was the community itself. So it wasn't just the houses that were designed to reduce the wind impact, but it was the design of how the houses were placed in the roads. And so you can see that the road structures and the housings were placed in such a way that there was not a wind tunnel created, but actually it broke up the winds to help reduce the impact. Unfortunately, we had a proof of concept the following year in that Typhoon Nari landed in Da Nang on October 2013. Um, the good news is that all the project houses were safe. There was one house that was under construction that was damaged, but all of the other houses were in fine shape. So the design elements withstood the direct hit of Typhoon Nari. Unfortunately, some of the other neighborhoods in Da Nang were not as well off, and about 200 homes were damaged or destroyed. Luckily, that proof of concept also helped establish the value of that for the city government and for the provincial government, and they were able to instill that in their policies, their learnings. Another way we can do this is to reduce the cost, actually. So how do you reduce the cost of mitigating the houses? And so that can also help break that cycle of poverty. So one way to do that is that you can, we did a cost benefit analysis that showed that doing this work, for every dollar spent on mitigating for the storm, saved $3 in future recovery costs. Now, that's a really good CBA, cost benefit analysis, for a donor, for a government. But when you're a really poor household, your discount horizon is not that far out. So some of the challenges are, how do we bring that value, which is a sort of a shared citywide or community-wide value, how can we bring that, reduce that barrier for the most at-risk homes? There's also a lack of technical knowledge, which drives up the cost. If there's not a ready supply of people who know how to do this work, it makes it very expensive to do. And there's a lack of supply chains. So the actual concrete and the actual products that make the homes is just not commonly available. And the lack of finance mechanisms, the lack of risk sharing, drive up the costs. And where's the... Apparently that's the end of my talk. There we go. So one way we addressed that, some of those gaps, was to produce technical knowledge products. So we produced 3 different knowledge products on the technical aspects of building such housing that were aimed at 3 different levels: one at the provincial and national government level, one for craftsmen and craftspeople and construction workers, and one for the households themselves, so they could understand, digest, and understand the work. Now, these are written in English, but the originals are all in Vietnamese, and these are translated from those. Another way of reducing costs is looking at financing mechanisms. So one of the innovations for this project was working with the Da Nang Women's Union. So historically, when people's homes were damaged, they would have to borrow money in order to rebuild them. Now, shelter is so central in their lives and so important in their livelihoods, of course, they would go to great lengths to do that. And for a lot of people, that led to them to borrow money from usurious lenders. And so there's a history of people winding up in cycles of debt and poverty that sink further and further and further. And with climate change, that's only going to get worse, and more people are going to be exposed to this risk. So working with the Da Nang Women's Union, a community organization, and working with the government, we were able to identify key low-cost loan methods and means such that without the threat of falling into a cycle of credit and debt, ways to help households rebuild with these added features, which add some cost to their homes. And fancy graphics later. So these were some of the means by which we did that, and that's through the government, with some of the middle, the sort of upper, lower income folks, and with the poorest of the poor through these community-based organizations: the Women's Union, the Youth Union, the Farmers Union. So some of the lessons from the event, from this work, has been that storm resilient housing is cost effective, our CBA work. Successful resilience building must respond to local conditions and local demands and local needs. The need to integrate housing into urban planning and development processes. So right now, a lot of urban planning is just on the land itself and understanding how different industry interacts with the land, but it's not really understanding how do you integrate housing into that more specifically, and how do you bring in some of these elements that help break up storm winds. Further engagement with the private sector to ensure a sort of a supply chain readiness, and scaling up and out and looking at risk sharing. How do you share this risk in through insurance, through government catastrophe bonds, which at the moment just isn't a focus, particularly at the policy level in Vietnam and in a lot of places. How do you share the risk so that one, that financing is available for people to recover? I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people. I'm up here not because I led this work, not because I am the key person to talk to, but because I was available. The Vietnam team is really responsible. The I said Vietnam team, is really responsible. They're all Vietnamese. They live in Hanoi, but they were just too busy to attend. Also, the Da Nang People's Committee and the Da Nang Women's Union and Foreign Affairs Office, who were very important. ACERN was central in getting this started. CDCAN and ADB were important in supporting this work historically. And of course, the Rockefeller Foundation for the work with ACERN. And here's some of the team, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. I think also that demonstrates the value of working through and with local organizations like the Women's Union to support bottom-up approaches. So our final presentation is from Arnaud Heckman, Principal Urban Development Specialist at the ADB. He is based in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, where he's managing urban and regional development projects and technical assistance. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me bring a bit of coldness in this event. Yeah, so we are going to talk about Mongolia and especially Ulaanbaatar, and see, I'm going to present the situation there and see, and especially describe two main projects we have done to integrate the poor peri-urban area of the capital city of Mongolia. I have 15 minutes, which is very short, and there is a lot of things to say. So you can see on the picture what is part of Ulaanbaatar. This is the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar. So you can see the figures. Mongolia is 3 million inhabitants. Half of it is living in the Ulaanbaatar city, and 60% of this 1.4 million living in Ulaanbaatar live in what we call gay areas. So what is gay areas? It's a peri-urban area, which was originally made by yurt, that we call ger in Mongolian, and which have extended, on time. So very, very typical phenomena, rural migration driven by climate change. People, start to live in the outskirts of Mongolia because the government was giving piece of land for the people who wanted to come to the capital city. It grows. People, and especially the politics, don't want to see it, thinks it will disappear, thinks it will be controlled. Not at all. And now it's becoming this monster of 800,000 people. So almost 35% of the whole country population. You can see some picture here, and I'm going to describe the situation. So this is summer and this is winter. This is still summer. This is winter. So you can see maybe on the top picture the difference between the city core, which is the city with all serve buildings and new fashion buildings, and the rest of the city, the gay areas. So those gay areas have basically no infrastructure. It means like there is dirt road, no water system, only water kiosk. So people have to go to fetch the water. You can see a picture here of a woman, standing and having those jar of water. So they have to go every day. As you can guess, mainly it's women, mainly it's kids with a very insecure environment because there is no light. So you can see how complicated it can be if you have, if you are vulnerable or disability, or if you have disability. No drainage system, so it's a pit latrine system. So everybody have a pit latrine in this plot, and some people have been living there for 30 years. Once the hole is full, then you change in your yard. So the soil pollution, the organic pollution of the soil is huge. In winter, it doesn't matter because minus 40 kills all the germ. But in summer, all the germs come back and it affects a lot of the people. In this situation in a tropical country, a lot of people will be dead already. And it's not only and no heating system. Sorry, no heating system. It is very important. No heating system. So everybody have a stove, eating at best with coal. So during winter, Ulaanbaatar is one of the most polluted city in the world because you have 800,000 people who use a stove burned with coal or other material to warm their place. So the pollution is huge in the areas and is huge in the city center. And it's not only that, it's not only basic infrastructure, it's missing everything. No kindergarten, or very few actually, no sport complex, very few school, no open space, no public space, and and lack of job opportunities. Because when we talk about vulnerability, of course, there is a vulnerability, in terms of services that you can have. But if you don't have a job, if there is a clash in the economy or something happen, then you are the first who suffer from that. And those areas doesn't provide those minimum, job opportunity that they can have. And all those people, they are urban. They have been living there for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. This is densifying. This is densifying. And when we start to work, it was in 2010. It was incredible. All the report we had in hand, they say, okay, gay areas, it's like that. So we put few water kiosks, we replace some stuff, but nothing can be done. They are Mongolian. They will not move from that. And let's see what happened. It was really like that. And we discovered that the mentality of the people was not like that at all. They are so tired in this situation. And actually, this is not only poor people. They have a job in the city center. They are fully urban. They are not nomad anymore. So the perception of the gay areas was really something which was very separated from the reality. And even in the city center, Mongolian have no idea of what is happening there. So when we have discussions sometimes, and when I put those figures, in a bar or in a restaurant, people are amazed. Really, that's much? It's incredible. Mongolian people. So the aim was also to say, okay, guys, the future of Ulaanbaatar, it's there. This is where is the future. So we have to do something. So we start with the basics and we say, okay, first you have to change the master plan because the master plan of the city was only focused in the city core. If you want to have a programmatic approach and be able to change the situation, you have to include the gay areas in the master plan. So the main tool of the first project was a strategy, how we improve the situation. You cannot put infrastructure everywhere. It's impossible. So you have to pick, the area where there is the most potential of growth. And so we have two actions, work with them on the master plan, you have to include that, and the strategy. Let's have a strategy where we upgrade small centers that are already existing. And let's put a package of infrastructure, but all the infrastructure, not only a bit of water or a bit of road, to make those centers to generate a redevelopment process and to densify. So basically, we cannot solve the issue, but let's try to mitigate it and let's try to densify where there is infrastructure and de-densify where there is not. So we put the strategy together and we develop an investment program to implement it. That's the beauty also of ADB. So you can play with the technical assistance and also with the infrastructure investment. So, and we worked a lot with the communities. What do you want? What are your priorities? How you want to be, engaged? What are the key things which is missing? And this is how we develop the investment plan. So this is a 10-year investment plan. We say, okay, let's develop 6 sub-centers within this gay area. So you can see here, you have the city center, you have the gay areas. And within those let's sub-center, let's work with the communities, how we can provide some loan, how we can provide basic infrastructure to help them to develop their own project, but also to attract the private sector. There's no way the private sector will come and invest in those areas because doing business in those areas is much more costly than other areas. Hmm? And oh, I forgot something. Let me come back to this one. Before we start, it was the plan was, hey, let's focus on the city center, let's densify, and we are going to put all those people in new apartment building. And we know that on-site development in this situation are the best way to go because, as it was presented in the first presentation, otherwise you cut the family link, you cut the livelihood possibility. So it has to be really on-site and let the people decide if they want to stay on-site or if they want to live somewhere else. But at least we need to provide the enable environment. So yeah, I have to go fast. So this is the infrastructure package I'm talking about: road, heating system, water, wastewater, kindergarten, business incubator, even sport complex, drainage, public space, etc. So for each of the subcenter, this is what we do. And we have also a lot of program for livelihood restoration. We partner with the bank to provide small loans for communities to be able to develop their own business or to upgrade the houses. Because once you have the key infrastructure, this is where it's meaningful to upgrade your own shelter. This is one subcenter, and this is the other one subcenter. Okay, I have to go fast. So this is the first one. But so the first one, and then there is a local development plan where we work with the local community and with the planning agencies to be able to attract the private sector and have their own communities to develop their own project. But one of the issue also is the affordable housing, because actually there was all the housing sector in the city center is targeting the high-end market, is completely saturated. But still people invest in that. And there is no affordable option for the people. Actually, the only affordable option for the people are the gay areas. And now you have even people from the city center who goes back to the gay areas because the city center is not affordable. So how can we increase the stock of affordable housing? And what we don't want is to develop high-rise building with a poor urban environment. So it has to be integrated. So we said, okay, let's build a big pilot program, 10,000 housing. And let's merge that into what we call eco district and redevelop 100 hectares of gay areas with all the sector reform that go with that. So this is eco district principle, mixed land use, with especially with public space and with job opportunities, with shops, entertainment area, social mix to avoid ghettoization. So we cannot only focus on social housing or affordable housing. It has to be mixed with also market rate housing. And why? Because there is a question also of operation and maintenance. If you mix all these different type of income, there is a better chance that the operation and maintenance can be developed. And also you can cross-subsidize, which is very important. And resilient and green. I have to go very fast now. So the program is supposed to deliver 15% of social housing, 55% of affordable housing, and 30% of market rate housing. We have to put solar panel, public space, greenhouses for urban farming, have certain average of density and building performance. And we deliver through blocks, and this is also one of the aspects of this project is a sector loan. So everywhere we identify people 100% who wants to participate, we can provide this block. So those block development are very interesting because it's a very pragmatic, very practical way. So by implementing it, you actually change little by little the city, and you can work also with the policy and the regulation. So I'm going fast. This is how it can change from one to the other one, but this is where I want to focus on. I have 3 minutes for that. Yes, it's really nice to have all kind of idea and design, but how you do it, how you implement it, what are the mechanisms you put in place to deliver, that's the most important. So we think a lot about that. And what we come up, don't be scared about this scheme. It's a kind of urban PPP. We said, okay, ADB, we have money. We are going to fight the vulnerability of those areas and fight also the carbon emission because they are highly polluting also. They are emitting a lot. So let's go to see a GCF and let's ask for high concessional loan. They have loan with 0% interest rate. It's really nice. And grant. And let's have a pool of public money we can use to deliver in those urban blocks all the key secondary infrastructure, public space, and social housing. And let the private sector develop the rest, affordable and market rate. And we want to control that through the design. So it's not a democratic system. We want to say to the private sector, okay, this is how it has to be. This is the cost where you are going to sell the affordable housing. Market rate, we don't care. Do whatever you want. If you can make more benefit on it, go for it. But we want this design and this price for affordable housing. So how you do that? You have to incentivize the private sector because they don't like when you told them what to do, especially when it comes to price. So we put together two financing tools. First one is a financial intermediary, where loans in Mongolia is 20%. So it's really high. But with this fund, we managed to give to the private sector 8% loan, not for everything, just for 30% of what they need. And they have to partner with the bank. So we put a fund that they can have access to deliver affordable and market rate for housing for each block. But this fund goes to the commercial bank and then to the real estate developer. Then the real estate developer develop the housing, pay back the bank, but the bank don't pay back the fund. The money stay in the bank and is used for mortgage. So it's a double-sided fund. Like that, we can target offer and demand with one tool. And it's a benefit for everybody. I mean, I am an household. I can have an apartment and there is a mortgage. I am a real estate developer. I sell an apartment and there is a mortgage. So this is the one of the main tools to incentivize the real estate developer to deliver what we want. And second, through the grant, it's a grant we will use to subsidize all the green technology and all the building performance aspects. So all the high installation system, if the developer develop based on the technical specification we mentioned, then he gets reimbursed. Green housing is the same, solar panel is the same. So we use those two tools to deliver the private part of the eco district. I have the bell. I go now very quickly. Okay, just one thing. It's voluntary resettlement. We don't want to impose anything to anybody. So we need to have 100% of the people who are ready and wants to move in those eco districts. So it's really demand-based. Only through when it's close to main trunk infrastructure, it can be implemented, and only in gay areas to also prioritize gay area people who wants to live in those areas. And it goes very well with the first one, right? So the first one, put the main trunk infrastructure, create the blocks, and then we can go on the blocks to develop the eco district. Actually, this is one block where we work. 95% of the population of the household here, they say, okay, I'm so tired to live the way I live. I want my apartment, I want my water, I want to feel warm. So yeah, this is where we are going to start. These are some screens. Just one last thing. One very important tool we have is a land swapping mechanism. So it's housing for everybody. You have a plot owner, asset owner. The scheme guarantee 35 square meter of apartment, because sometimes when you have land valuation, you cannot even take this threshold. So this is what we guarantee. Some are much bigger, but you cannot go lower. If you rent a place, then you go to renting housing. That's ADB and the government is going to finance. So we try to have a solution for everybody depending on the income. Sorry, I have no time anymore. Yeah, and then many features that I cannot describe here. Actually, this project have been rated the highest in all the GCF criteria of the independent panel. So we are quite proud of it in terms of adaptation, mitigation, impact, etc. We have, in terms of smart city, all the building will be with scan and with a central system to seek the performance, a lot of reform and policy sector, greenhouses with urban farming, livelihood improvement, and community-based soil waste management. I mean, all those details. Sorry, it was too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Arno. I think maybe when we have time for questions, if anyone wants to pick up on any further details, but I think that's really interesting because it shows a larger scale project involving a number of different actors, including the private sector as well. And I think that's always a missing actor in a lot of discussions around how we can build resilience in urban areas. So before we move on to opening the floor for questions, we have Shantanu Mitra, Senior Climate and Environment Advisor from the UK Department for International Development, or DFID, to offer some thoughts and reflections for us.
Thank you very much, Diana. And it's been really fascinating to hear these three presentations. And I'm not sure I'm going to do justice to them, but I just did have a few reactions. I thought they were quite complimentary. It was very interesting to hear three presentations on initiatives which do have some commonalities, but I think very quite different approaches, and I think something to be learned from what each of them does well and what each of them perhaps doesn't do so well. And I'll perhaps elaborate a little bit on that. I did think, I mean, what was interesting, that housing was a common entry point for all three, and that did raise some questions in my mind as to why that came out as a priority. At least two of them, I think, seem to me to be more focused on resilience to short-term extreme events, perhaps, than perhaps long-term resilience. And if you were to take that lens, I wonder if there would be a broader set of interventions that one would look at and at different scales, and a much longer-term perspective on development. I think one thing to remember is that I think, as we've heard a lot this morning, that resilience and promoting resilience does require an integrated, multidimensional approaches, integrated thinking, and working at different scales and with different partners. I think while that's very much true, I think in terms of individual interventions and initiatives, it's as we've seen today, I think we have to break the issue down to some extent and to learn lessons through piloting. And the pilots sometimes, as I think all three have are quite, in my view, quite partial approaches. And that's not a criticism, but it does raise an issue about why these particular and how these particular approaches and issues were prioritized, number one. And secondly, what are the complementary issues that are not being addressed through these? Are they being addressed by other players in these environments? And perhaps equally, if there were other things being addressed, would these issues and these needs emerge as quite the same level of priority? These are quite general points. Maybe it'll be clearer if I illustrate when I make some specific comments. But just finally, I mean, three general perspectives that I would look at these through, and three questions I would ask. And I think all of these have come out in various of the sessions and comments this morning. Firstly, as I said just now, to what extent are they informed by integrated, multidimensional, multisectoral thinking? Secondly, to what extent do they leverage the efforts of different stakeholders, communities, government, and private sector? And thirdly, what are the prospects for each of them to really scale up? We've heard a lot about scaling up this morning, so how you really get larger amounts of financing leveraged behind these, how you can actually influence policies, regulations, so that some of this might get locked in. And I think that the three examples we've heard on these three principles perhaps have different strengths and weaknesses. So let me just turn to some specific comments. I mean, clearly the first presentation from Manila was clearly the most community-driven approach. And I think one point to make, I mean, we talk about the role of communities, but not just about community consultation, but I think the strength of this one, at the point you made, was that communities having the agency. And to what extent are we empowering, are these approaches empowering communities and putting resources in the hands of communities and really having what's being done, the interventions driven by and managed by them. Clearly, this example was very strong in that respect. So I think interesting that housing and water supply came out, and I assume that was informed by an understanding of what are the particular problems, most acute problems felt by the communities when there are flooding and extreme events happening. And I assume there's also technical support being provided so that the actual investments in the housing can be made to appropriate specifications. But the land tenure, I think, is a very powerful driver, clearly. And I think we've heard this in development thinking more broadly, enabling people to actually leverage their assets and access financing on the back of this. It'd be interesting to know whether they're actually able to raise financing on the back of the collateral they have, and whether they actually are doing that, and whether they're able to raise finance both to invest in improving their housing, but also be interesting to know whether they're actually raising finance to invest in other uses. For example, building skills, micro enterprises, which are other forms of building resilience, maybe longer term resilience. So that's an interesting set of questions there. But I think the point about maybe two of the issues which are questions in my mind, not necessarily weaknesses, but this is a very, very bottom-up, community-driven approach. Has there been any consideration given to interventions which would need to be taken by higher scales, not at the community level, larger scale investments in flood prevention, in interventions in terms of housing locations, regulations? So there are some questions in my mind as to whether there's any advocacy being done on what the communities need the governments to do, or whether it really is the communities acting on their own and doing what they can do with these limited resources they have. So there is a question in my mind as to on what scale and to what extent this really solves the underlying issues. Another question in my mind was about the scalability and the scaling up. If I understand, the funding is really coming from community-based organizations. So there is a question in my mind as to where this is all going to go in future. Has there been an engagement with government in the process, both of prioritization and then the advocacy for solutions? So I think those are some of the questions in my mind on the Manila example. Just turning to the example from Vietnam, I think it has some similarities. It addresses clearly a very specific issue about the quality and resilience of housing to natural extreme events. Had similar questions as to whether this approach was, there was some consultation done, but to what extent and how you identified this, and whether there were other issues that came up which could have actually done more through public interventions or through information services, early warning systems to provide resilience. It seems to me the intervention is very much about improving the quality of housing. And so firstly, where does that sit within the broader range of interventions which would need to be taken to build the resilience of these communities? Where are the prospects of uptake by government? I think it does seem in principle that it's something that should be quite amenable to private sector engagement. You said the cost benefits are quite high. What is the financial viability for the private sector to invest in this without support from government funds? So there are questions in my mind as to how this would all be scaled up. Yeah. So let me move on to the third one, which I think was quite different in that it's clearly a much more top-down, government-led approach, which again has strengths and weaknesses. I think in terms of scalability, it's automatically linked to government policies, long-term planning, presumably larger amounts of resources which will go into this. I think there are clearly some strengths in this. The link to economic development strategy, the link to the broader city planning and master planning should be advantages. Um, there was a question in my mind about, again, it's two sides of the coin. This one has a stronger focus uh, on government-led approaches. Where is the community in this? You mentioned consultations. I would ask the question as to whether it just has been a process of consultation, which, as we know from development practice in the past, consultations can be a little bit of a, you know, tick box exercise. Uh, to what extent have the communities really been empowered? Has there been agency, in the words of Suranjana, to the communities to identify the priorities? To what extent has the city really been listening to this? So the question is how, to what extent these interventions are informed by the communities. Um, and is there any sense through these interventions or through the master planning that there are going to be any policy interventions which are actually going to empower communities, not just um, ensure that communities are consulted in the process? And that's not to criticize or question that these interventions are sensible. I mean, it's quite a powerful case, it seems to me, to focus on communities which are migrating into the city because of, you said, environmental pressures. I'd be interested to know what is the strength of the link between climate impacts and the migration that is happening here. I'd also be interested to know whether these are, in fact, among the poorest communities in the city. So, there's a number of questions that this begs in my mind. Yeah. So I think, as I said, I think the strengths and weaknesses of all of these exercises. Um, I would one final question. I think point in terms of the scaling up, which may be relevant to all of these, and I don't think anyone actually mentioned these. Many countries in Asia, I don't know if it applies to all the countries. I think it certainly does to the Philippines and perhaps Vietnam. Is large government publicly sponsored community-driven development programs, which are based on bottom-up planning and put resources in the hands of communities. And I just wondered if that's been seen as an opportunity to use these vehicles to scale up some of these approaches. Um, so these are just some of the questions that were in my mind. I just think we're all in a process of learning about this. I think uh, for us in DFID, I don't think we do a lot of programming on adaptation. I'm not sure we have got the right balance between community-driven approaches and more technical or public sector-led approaches for adaptation. Um, I'm not sure, and I hope the Global Commission on Adaptation can help answer some of these questions. Where should the balance of effort be on adaptation? Where's the value for money between community-driven versus public sector-led approaches? But I think that one strength and I think one opportunity from all of this is to do what I think is overdue and refocus development as a whole on a community-led approach and a pro-poor approach, which I think to some extent perhaps has ebbed a little in the last 10 to 15 years. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would our panelists like to respond to some of these questions briefly before we open up the floor?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the challenge in the Mongolian example, but I think it's you have to please everybody, and that's the problem. You cannot be only community driven, you cannot be state driven or private sector driven, and this is the triptych that you have to always play with. You need to please everybody to have those integrated approach work. So in the case of Mongolia, we had many consultation, a lot, but at the end of the day, the answer are always the same. We want water, we want wastewater, we want a kindergarten, we want a park. So putting all those things together is quite easy actually. They need just the basic elements, and in those schemes, I feel sometimes so sorry because it takes so much time for a concept. Now we are in the construction phase. It's 4 or 5 years, and the committee say, "Hey guys, can you expedite a little bit?" In interesting stuff also is in the affordable housing. I mean, there is nothing you can do without the plot owners to be part of it. Zero. So we had a lot of consultations to see what they want, how they want the design, etc., etc. And sometimes people are quite dynamic. And I remember one time one guy stand up and start to shout at us in Mongolian, and we say, "Oh my God, he's insulting us." What he was saying, "Stop asking us. The more you're asking us, you will never do it. Just do it. Just do it. We are so tired to live in this situation." So, it's a bit also of this, back and forth. You need to understand what they want, but you have to propose something. Because if you just say, okay, what you want, and you don't give them the tool, most of the people they work, they have everything to think about it except what you can do. So it's really a game that you have to play with them and to see, to be able to take what they want, what they need, what is the need, and how you crystallize into a planning and a program that fits what they want also. And of course you need to give them the tool to enjoy the enable environment you are doing. So finance, training skills, etc., etc. Yeah.
And I would probably didn't situate this project within as well as I could have, which is that it was part of the ACERN process. So it actually was one project among multiple projects that were identified from the process of the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network. And that used the process of doing shared learning dialogues across scales and to identify what key interventions were needed to help address the holistic qualities and the systemic thinking of Da Nang province in that case. There's some great cases of scaling up out of India as well with ACERN, where we worked with communities in Gorakhpur to identify a flooding issue. But in the end, when it was working with the community to identify it, one of the key things our partner there, Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group, did was to organize the community to go to other wards in the city and tell them how they did it and tell them how to bring their concerns to the city. So it depends on the location, of course, but how you integrate these different systemic issues together. So this housing project in Da Nang was one of the projects that sort of budded out of that process.
Need to answer? Okay. Um, so I'll try and answer some of the questions that you placed before us, Shantanu. The first issue on why, how did we come to this issue of housing? I think we're talking about the 90s here, before the world started talking very seriously about adaptation, and this word was not even in my vocabulary, or it meant something else, nothing to do with climate change. So this was actually, the relocation program was led by the government. It was a government program relocating 7,200 families. And if you go online, you can also see the infrastructure work was supported by the Japanese government, and evaluation surveys clearly corroborate what Joka said about people being very happy about the quality of housing and the quality of roads and reduced flooding, but having a problem with their incomes and livelihoods. So we really chose this because it was one of the sort of major issues that Dampa had worked on. And the point is that I think for me it was important to show that an organized community has keeps working on various solutions, because there's a whole basket of risks and vulnerabilities that they face. And as and when opportunities come to them or resources come to them, they prioritize something and go for it. So we organized risk mapping, or we supported risk mapping in some communities several years later. And surprisingly, it was water supply, which is, you wouldn't think that in Manila, there would be such water shortages. But they chose water supply because essentially because they were an informal settlement, and that became the issue that they wanted to focus on organizing around. So, following Typhoon Haiyan, they chose the regeneration of livelihoods through revolving funds. So, I think with local communities, they have so many problems they have to deal with every day that it depends on what, and some many problems, many solutions are self-financed. So you look at communities who are doing waste management. Some are setting up waste banks, raising money, doing recycling work, and then funding some small things are funded through community funds that are generated through savings and group incomes and the pooled savings, and then some they have to try and leverage money from other sources. I let Jokas talk to you about the livelihoods and other funds and resources they've leveraged from the government. But on scalability, again, it's kind of not as straightforward as the government picking up something and going to scale with it. But I think we are looking at it in two ways. One is as a learning network, we keep um, pulling together the different kinds of solutions that different groups have created in different sectors, whether it's in the area of building more resilient agriculture, water supply, or housing, and then creating this sort of pool of solutions that communities can transfer across one another. So it happens both at the country level within countries and across countries. So over a period of time, uh, there's been a whole set of grassroots trainers who are able to go out and train other people, as well as go and advocate for more resources from government. Um, and the other piece, of course, is financing. So, as Wiro Commission, we've been raising money to provide small grants to various communities to try and initiate or scale up their uh, adaptation or resilience building initiatives. And so, I would say this is now poised to go to a larger scale, but it would need larger scale financing. And that includes also some technical support and capacity building around supporting communities to manage larger finances, as well as develop ways to articulate the gains of their work more clearly so that it fits with the kinds of things that funders want to see when they put out money and put it in the hands of local communities. So
So yeah, I think it's for me based on my experience in working in the urban areas, it's important that the urban communities and even rural must be organized. So we must be organized, and the people must have savings mechanisms. And then you need to, if you're organized, you need to build a cloud. In building a cloud, that's the way that you can access some programs from the government. So you need to collaborate with with the government and private institutions, do partnerships, and those savings mechanisms very important, because if you have savings, it's as if you are marketing that, oh, we do this savings, and that's the time that the government is what they call this one, they are willing to assist or give subsidy from them. And that's our strategy. So organizing, building networks, collaboration, consultations, and partnership with the government. So we get a lot of progress that, like in water cooperative, we access 1 million in in water piping from the government. And then in high and affected areas, we access livelihood programs like raising swine raising, and we also access some like community livelihood programs, like we access milking carabao from the Philippine Carabao Society, and we access some like raising some chicken, kalahi seeds. And in Calaices, we have some communities and barangays which has infrastructure already. That before these barangays are flooded, and it's very difficult for farmers to let their products going to market. But now it's very easy now because it's cemented, and then the creek are already a brief wrap, so the flooding was is out. It's no longer like before. So all we do this is we access all these things because of organizing collaborations with the government and partnership with them, and we build the cloud. In building a cloud, it's very important so that you will be recognized. And it's not no, it's the grassroots. It's a community based. It's grassroots led organizing, not it is led by the people who are outside from the community. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. So I think we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. So are there any questions from the floor? We can probably take one or two. Anyone? Everyone desperate to go for a cocktail? I'd be interested, if no one else has any questions, to think a little bit more about the role of the private sector, not only well, firstly, the private sector, as we know, is driving a lot of development in Asian cities, shopping malls, hotels, office blocks, etc. So they are also playing a part in reinforcing the marginalization or the vulnerability of certain communities, marginalized communities in cities. So how can we engage, or what can be done to try and sort of address this issue? Is there a need for more enforcement of planning regulations? Incentives for certain forms of development.
Actually, that original photo that I showed you from Houston, that we have some really good cases from Houston. Houston is an environment where there's very little, the land use planning is very weak. There's not a lot of central government control over how land is used. And actually there's emergent coordination amongst landowners on how they wind up developing and planning the land. So that there were events in Houston where there was whole housing tracts that were built within the reservoir pool that got flooded when the reservoirs had to fill. So those are the sorts of governance situations. And so what they found is that the private sector actually wound up taking a lot of um, taking a lot of control of disaster planning. They realized that because they were so affected by the flood and that there was no real government in charge, that they had to sort of coordinate with their employees and with themselves on how they could recover from the disaster, how quickly they could regain access to their land and property. There was one place where they didn't realize that their elevator was dependent on a part that was going to be 3 months before it was available. So being able to plan for things like this and understand their capital and their plant, as they call it, or being able to reach out to their employees to remind them to be prepared for disasters was another means that we saw in Houston.
Okay, so I just want just one more. Uh, I think if we want to strengthen resilience building to our communities, it's very important to be inclusive, and so that no one will be left behind. So,
No, I mean, private sector is such a powerful force. It's beyond understand. I mean, look here in Manila. I mean, they can raise city from ground like that, right? But of course, it has to be controlled and oriented for the community or for the public good. And this is all what is at stakes. How we can use this force to make more resilient, livable city, which provide the basics. And this is what is at stakes. And you cannot trust. I mean, if you are in a country where the enforcement of the law and the planning is really strong, you might achieve it. But most of the time, it's not the case. You might have a land use plan and it goes to urban jungle because the private sector, they bribe, they pay, they are driven by the profit. Fair, fine enough. So how to control it? And this is a bit what we try in the case of Ulaanbaatar. So guys, we are take care of everything. We deal with the communities. we organize them, we see what they want, we develop the design. You just have to do what to put your buildings where we want and at a certain price. And for that, you need to have the right incentive and the right motivations to take the prices. That's why, I was saying at the beginning, you need to please everybody, which is very hard actually. You cannot have one angle.
Thank you. And I think just to add another example, goes with Ken's example, is that private sectors, their assets are not just their built capital; it's also their employees. So if their employees are flooded out, or all the roads are flooded or destroyed in an earthquake, then how can their employees get to work? It's not just about protecting the factory or the office building; it's also about the people working there as well. So, do we have any final burning questions? Time to go. So maybe I'll just ask our panelists to give one quick take-home message, one sentence, the message you'd like everyone to take back from today's session. Who would like to start?
I think it's important to again emphasize the bottom-up approach and how valuable that is, and particularly bring up issues around power, how donors represent power, and how can we bring that into our thinking when we work at the community level. And so I would just highlight that.
Very okay, I'll say everything is possible. I mean, what you have in mind, what you want to do, either as as an individual or as an organization, everything is possible. You just need to put the willingness and the energy for that, and aim high and at the long term. And if you work for that, the things will happen.
I think we need more dialogue leading to collaboration. We're talking about partnership and collaboration, but when we come from very different sectors and very different kinds of stakeholders, and the word partnership is a little bit of a misnomer because there's very unequal power relation. Everybody has different levels of power, and that power which some are struggling to redistribute and some are happy with, we have to kind of disrupt that. So I think it's a very, very hard thing actually to get partnerships going from these very different stakeholders with different worldviews. So we need more facilitated dialogue and collaboration, and doing and actually we have to test those collaborations on the ground. So rather than the toolkit and the manual, let's get the thing going and then learn from that.
All I need to say is that it's very important to be organized and have a political will. So it's very important that our government officials have a political will to partner with us and to help in building resilience communities. So,
I don't know if I have any particular pearls of wisdom, but I'll just repeat perhaps what I said at the end before, that I think perhaps what we need to rediscover a couple of things which perhaps have fallen a bit out of fashion in development. One is um, a participation and community-driven development, and secondly, integrated development approaches and marry the two. And how can we incorporate communities more strongly into planning, whether it's at the city level or the national level? And I think also globally, we need to build the evidence base on, we're serious about climate adaptation. I mean, we also conceptually, we've heard a lot about the need for integrated and community-led approaches. I think we need to build the evidence more on the types of community resilience approaches which have succeeded and can be effective.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of our panelists for your really interesting and diverse presentations. I think we covered a range of scales and approaches, and also uncovered a range of issues that we really still need to work on. But there is evidence from the ground that there are approaches that work, and we will continue to work on those and scale them up across the region. So please join me in thanking our panelists again.
Ako ba? Session mo yan. Nakakanta mo entertainment. Mas ulit. Salamat.